You can't hear.
If we can get started. Good morning. Good morning, all of you. Welcome to the first day of the real sessions of Directors College. I thought we had a terrific kickoff last night with John Donahoe and Marissa Meyer, and today we begin the real sessions. I'm Cy Lorne, and our speaker at this session, Gary Retelny, who I'll introduce in a moment. But first, I want to make just a couple of observations. Every year, when people leave Directors College, they tell us it was a terrific program, and I think they mean that. I hope they're not just saying it to us. But they also say that what we really got out of it, we didn't get so much from the speakers as we did from each other. That it was the discussions at the meals like this, it was the discussions between the sessions, it was the ideas that came out of the talks, that came out of the sessions that sparked discussions. And I encourage you all to be aware of that and to be open to that as we go through the next couple of days. I hope and expect that at the end of the day tomorrow, you'll be tired. That will indicate that you've put in the effort that it takes really to make Directors College a success. And to get things started today, we have Gary Retelny. On the back of the cards at your places, you can see Gary's entire background, well, a summary of his entire background. But Gary was with Morgan Stanley and was with Morgan Stanley when he developed and spun off MSCI, which a couple of years ago acquired a company called Risk Metrics that had this little subsidiary called Institutional Shareholder Services, ISS. Now, there isn't a director of a public company in this room who has not been at a session, typically around February for a calendar year company, preparing the proxy statement and thinking about stock options or something. And the question is, what does ISS think? Because ISS, well, there's some disagreement, and Gary, I'm sure we'll get into this, some disagreement about how much influence it has. Between the question is whether it has way too much influence or just too much influence. Gary, of course, thinks it doesn't have enough influence, right. But that's a different question. What we're going to have is question and answer. I'll ask Gary some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. But I think you'll find, frustratingly, that Gary is very engaging, very open, recognizes the questions, thinks about the questions, is aware of the concerns, and it's enormously frustrating because you'd like to walk away saying he's an arrogant jerk, and you can't really say that after you've listened to him.
We'll try.
Anyway, Gary, you're in the middle of 2013. It has been kind of an extraordinary year for proxies. You've had a couple of big fights. You've been in the middle of it. What's going on this year? Is it a different year? Is it something about the weather? There's certainly different weather here. What?
Yes. This is great weather to start with ISS as a topic, I am sure. Thank you, Cy, and thank you, Joe, for inviting me and inviting ISS to participate. We were kidding about this before, but I am also an alum of Stanford, and this is not the typical weather that we used to get here. This season, it appears to be more contentious than it has in the past, because you have seen some incredibly high-profile issues with various companies that are very prominent. They're front and center. You read about them in the Wall Street Journal and other papers. But in fact, if you actually look at the statistics, this was a generally plain vanilla type of a season. Other than a very handful of very high profile situations, whether they were proxy related on acquisitions or specifically on director issues or succession. We can talk about any and all of them if you would like. If you actually look at the statistics so far, it has been a generally quiet season.
People who were shareholders of JPMorgan didn't think it was such a quiet
Absolutely not.
season. There was this little question about Jamie Dimon being both chairman and CEO and whether that was appropriate. And the ballot last year, that measure was on the shareholder ballot and received a fair amount of support. And then there was the London whale incident that we'll get more discussion later on today, actually. And then it became one of the cause celeb of the year. Do you regret that? Do you think that was a good fight? What's your reaction to that whole episode?
It's interesting. ISS really doesn't pick fights, and we just respond to what's in the proxy. If the issue is not in the proxy, there really isn't much that ISS should do. We actually come up with our recommendations and our data, and then we literally get out of the way. So just to give a little bit of background, the way that ISS is used by most institutional investors are really twofold. They either look at the recommendations that we put out, or I should say, they look at the data that we put out. But what really institutional investors and others are subscribing when they subscribe to the ISS services are essentially our data. And some of them use it to generate their own recommendations. Others use it to validate our own recommendations and or to create their own custom policy operations. Many vote in ways that are different than what ISS recommends. But specifically with regards to JPMorgan, first, the issue of chair and CEO was already on the proxy in 2012. And it was fairly uncontentious. It didn't really create much. What happened was that you had the London whale incident clearly, and a host of many, many other regulatory issues with regards to JPMorgan that have been in the press. A committee of Congress put out a fairly comprehensive report of findings, and they've had issues on a regulatory basis, as well as the major losses that came from the London whale incident. ISS is all about risk management and risk mitigation. So what we were looking at was what did the directors do with respect to what actually happened at JPMorgan, and did they fulfill their obligations, their fiduciary duties, and did they do what they needed to do to make sure that the board was providing the proper oversight of the institution. And that's the way ISS looked at it. The issue of chair and CEO only became an issue because we felt that the board, in some instances, had not provided the proper oversight with regards to risk management, risk controls, and then more importantly, what did they do after everything came out? What actions did the board take? What actions did the directors take in response to the problems that came out? And because of what we saw in the conversations that we had, we thought that it was the proper course of action to recommend against the members of the risk committee, as well as to recommend for the separation of the chair and CEO. JPMorgan in many ways made it a referendum about Jamie Dimon. That never was what we were talking about. We had no issue and have no issue with that. What we had issues were simply with the board oversight of what was happening at JPMorgan, risk-wise, and the actions that the board took. And if you actually look at the vote, and you see the vote, and you see what the votes were for the three members of the risk committee, I believe it was 52%, 57%, 59% for. Those are not good numbers for a director, particularly when most directors, I would say over 90+% directors, get in the 90s in terms of a 4. So when you're looking at numbers below 70 and when you're looking at numbers in the 50s, you have an issue. You have almost half of your shareholder base that believes that you as a director did not fulfill your obligations in terms of risk management. So the press picked it up and made it all about Jamie Dimon. This was never about Jamie Dimon. This was about risk mitigation, risk control, and board oversight of the risks of a major financial institution. So,
Although I think when you have an individual who is chairman and chief executive, and you recommend splitting the offices, it inevitably becomes about that individual. And JPMorgan had record profits, notwithstanding all of the issues. And it's perfectly understandable that Jamie Dimon took it personally when you said Jamie Dimon should not have both roles. How do you get at the problem? The ideal time, it seems to me, to split chairman and CEO is at the time of succession. And it's always going to be very hard to split a sitting chairman and CEO unless he or she thinks it's a good idea and recommends it. How do you get at that problem?
It's a very good question. The ISS per se is not against, in spite of what most people believe, ISS is not against the combined CEO and chairman role, as long as there is a very strong lead director with the proper governance in place. And if you actually look at, and I don't have the full set of numbers, I think there were I believe, close to 60 occasions this season to recommend against or recommend for the separation of chair and CEO, and I think we did less than half. So 28 out of 58 was the last number that I saw somewhere. But if you actually look at that, you'll see that in spite of what is in the press, ISS is not dogmatically saying that chair and CEO should be separated. So we only recommend for that separation when there are issues, particularly, as you well say, when the roles are combined in one individual. It is much harder for a director or board of directors to deal with the separation of chair and CEO when someone has it, because you could be deemed to be sending a personal message to an individual. But again, what we're looking for are risk management, risk controls. Is the board doing what it needs to do? Is it exercising its fiduciary duty? If the role is combined and they are doing that, or they seem to be doing that, we really have no issue with it. Having said that, it is much harder, as you well say, to try to separate the roles when you have an incumbent. Very difficult.
You said you don't mind combined chairman CEO when there's a lead director, a presiding director. I think JPMorgan calls it a presiding director. They have one, Lee Rabin. I'm sure you talked to him during the course of that debate. I don't want to get into the individual personalities, but what does it take for a lead director or a presiding director to be substantially equivalent to a separated chairman?
It's a great question. Let me just say this with regards to lead directors, and I guess rather than get into the specifics of the JPMorgan situation and Lee Raymond specifics, lead directors have an incredibly important role to play, and how they play that role matters. And it matters not only to ISS, it matters to your shareholders, to your owners. Clients of ours who happen to be institutional investors who own the vast majority of publicly traded securities really look to the lead director when the roles are combined to make sure that there is proper oversight and proper governance. And what happens many times is that you have lead directors who view themselves much more reactive to CEOs. They view themselves as a sounding board. And that's great. That's something that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, that's why you want to have directors on boards that are experienced. But having said that, that's not enough. It might have been enough many years ago, but shareholders today expect a lot more. They expect lead directors to be proactive. They expect them to be much more involved in the processes of the company in terms of running the governance of the board, in terms of director selection, in terms of setting the agenda, in terms of making sure that what needs to happen at the board level in terms of conversations do happen. And as long as that is the case, you see lead directors exercising properly their roles. In the JPMorgan case, ISS felt that that was not there.
Another company that had a fair amount of reported internal dispute, actually, I should rephrase that, there was no reports of internal dispute at JPMorgan, was Occidental Petroleum. Can you talk to us a little bit about ISS role perception in that context?
Oxy was essentially all about succession planning and leadership and management. You had a former CEO on the board, a very strong former CEO on the board, and you also had a lead director. It came across in the press as well as in others, and we did talk to a number of directors there as well, that there were very strong differences of opinion inside the boardroom with regards to succession and the way that it was handled. So ISS recommended against the two directors that we're talking about here. And I believe, I might be wrong, but I don't think I am, I believe that one of them got the lowest 4 votes ever in terms of a director getting votes. I think he got in the 20s and then resigned. So ISS was part of those conversations, but it wasn't only ISS. It is one of those situations where we got an incredible number of calls from all kinds of constituencies, mostly institutional shareholders who own the stock, who were extremely upset and troubled, with what they saw inside of the boardroom, and felt that there wasn't proper governance and that the board needed to essentially get its act together.
It's interesting. You said you talked to individual directors.
Yes.
Within the board. How often do you engage with individual directors, and is there a way individual directors should or should not be prepared to engage with ISS? I know company counsel has very strong views on that question, but I suspect ISS may have different views.
We encourage, this is a very broad topic, but I'll try to be very succinct. Historically, directors did not engage with ISS or with its own shareholder base. And that is changing in a very, very significant way. Obviously, CEOs and general counsels and others internally do not like it. They still do not like it. And I'm guessing that they discourage it. For many times good reason. But there is a significant desire by your owners, the shareholders, to hear directly from directors. Because they want to make sure that what is on their mind is being listened to, and that the information that you're getting on the board is not filtered by management. They want to hear that you know what the issues are, that you've thought about them, that you've vetted them, and then made whatever decisions you made yourself. So I think that there is a significant amount of change going on, and this is particularly new in the last 2 to 3 years, where directors are reaching out a lot more than they have in the past, primarily to shareholders, and that is what ISS encourages, by the way. We encourage engagement by directors, as well as to ISS. In terms of reaching out to ISS, it's pretty straightforward and simple, and we do hear from many, many more directors now. This year in particular, much more than in prior years. We do not go out and solicit conversations with directors. We don't go out and place calls and say, can we talk to you? But we are more than happy to take any incoming call from any director of a publicly traded company with regards to issues. One important thing, though, that I should note is that for ISS to use the information in our own analysis and recommendations, it has to be publicly available. We have many, many conversations now with directors, but for us to use the information, for it to have any impact in terms of the recommendation, whether it's changing what ISS had originally thought, or whether it was in support of where we were, it has to be public. We have to access it publicly because that is the only way that your shareholders will be able to access it so that they can make up their own minds. So hopefully that helps clarify a bit.
Why don't we shift gears a little bit, Gary? ISS itself. I've heard reports that around proxy season, when ISS is thinking about a recommendation for or against, companies may happen about the same time to get calls selling ISS consulting services. And at least the recipients of those calls feel that there may be a connection and that they may be under a little bit of pressure to retain ISS.
So that was an accusation that I had heard prior to us acquiring RiskMetrics and obviously ISS. I have never seen any evidence of that. I have talked to a whole host of people, and I asked anybody and everybody that I run into about that. And they, comp consultants in particular, comp consultants to compensation committees of the board, I asked them what they hear and what they see. And they say that that was, quote, the word on the street many, many years ago. It's certainly not the case now. We have an incredibly strong Chinese. Well, actually, just for the record, that group that we're talking about, the consulting group, is precluded from reaching out to companies while we are in the midst of proxy season, writing and studying about them. So once that company files a proxy and we're doing our research, the group cannot reach out. Absolutely not. And if I ever hear of anybody breaching that wall or making that statement to a company, they will be fired on the spot. We've made that extremely clear internally. So I'm very confident. I haven't heard of one myself. Maybe they won't come up and tell me, but the fact is that we think if in fact there was a problem many years ago, it's certainly not a problem today.
Well, when the people here go back to their companies and the company talks about that kind of, who should they call?
Me. If it's that specific point,
yeah,
they should call me or email me.
Okay.
Absolutely, okay. Because that is just not acceptable.
What's the email?
I think it's in the, I thought it was distributed. It's Gary.Retelny at issgovernance.com or .msci.com is shorter. Same
I just
email.
wanted to make sure it was as easy as possible to
Yes.
put that rumor to rest.
Yes.
Now, last month, I don't want you to feel like you're on the hot seat,
That's okay.
Gary, at all, but last month you settled, maybe the month before, an SEC case that suggested ISS personnel had not treated company information confidentially the way they should have. And there are probably limits on what you can say in response to an SEC settlement, but to the extent you can respond, here's the opportunity.
Well, thank you. First of all, we disclosed everything in our own filings. So if you're interested in reading about the settlement, which happens to be on our website, and you can access it there, or on the SEC's website themselves, as well as an 8K that we filed about a year ago, and when it first came to our attention. So everything that we know is in those filings. We try to be as transparent as possible. So what happened was that this goes prior to MSCI acquiring RiskMetrics. For a number of years, it seems that the Proxy solicitor had a very strong relationship with an employee of ISS, and he was getting information on how companies were voting with regards to various issues that the Proxy solicitor was looking into, probably on the behalf of companies, in exchange for gifts. And once we found out about that, obviously we terminated the person immediately, and we put in even stricter controls and audit controls. So it was quite unfortunate. The reason it came to light anyway was because we are a registered investment advisor. So I believe we're the only proxy advisor that actually is a registered investment advisor. So the SEC has jurisdiction over us. So as soon as we heard about it, we acted. And actually, many of the things that you will read in terms of the settlement, we actually had done about a year before. But it takes a while to go through the process.
Yeah, before MSCI was spun off, before you acquired ISS, you were a secretary and you'd been in corporate boardrooms, and I'm sure you had heard the discussions about the evil ISS. What was your sense before the acquisition, and how's it changed since the acquisition, except now that you're on the right side?
Yes. So MSCI grew up inside of Morgan Stanley, and through acquisitions, the acquisition of BAR, actually, a company right here in the Bay Area, in 2004, we grew, and in 2007 we went public, and eventually separated from Morgan Stanley by 2009. So for those few years prior to us going public, I really was the person inside of MSCI working on our governance structures, making sure that when the time came, we were going to have a proper board of directors and the committees and the governance of the committees, and negotiating the separation with Morgan Stanley, putting in all our governance in place. So I became the corporate secretary, and I'll share this with you, which is a little bit embarrassing given my current position. When I was talking to some of the senior folks at Morgan Stanley, I had all these great ideas about comp programs, and I actually put in our comp programs at MSCI. And I said, this is what I think works, and this is how we are going to align pay for performance, actually before I knew what the term was. And I remember one of the fellows, I think it was the global head of comp and benefits, looking at me and said, ISS is not going to like that. And I said, who cares? And I said, who is ISS anyway? And what does it matter? So 8 years ago, whatever it was, I really did not know, and I guess I got punished for that.
Now you're paying the price.
Now I'm paying the price. So, but even then, it had a certain amount of sway over how people viewed comp. And what I've come to learn now is that there are an incredible amount of misconceptions about ISS, how it does what it does, how it sets policies. ISS does, there's about 44,000 public companies in the world. ISS is a commitment to actually publish a recommendation on any company that an institutional investor who is a client owns in their portfolio. So we do about 37,000 of these a year, just to put things a little bit in perspective. But going back to it, as from a corporate secretary point of view, which I still am, and I'm still very involved in our comp programs, I can see where the influence is that ISS has, but at the same time I can see some of the good things that they have actually pushed for and put in place in many ways at the behest of institutional investors. First and foremost, the pay for performance linkage. And if there's one thing that you should all take away from this, particularly chairs of comp or members of the comp committee, is that the number one thing that we look at with regards to say on pay is really the linkage between pay and performance. So,
yeah, Gary, I want to open this up to questions from the audience, but let me ask one last question before we open it up. And I touched on it at the beginning, really. Is ISS too powerful? Is it inappropriate in the United States capital markets for any one institution to have the kind of power over shareholder votes that people ascribe to ISS?
So ISS has, to the extent ISS has any power or significant influence, it is something that is given to it by its clients. It's not something that is mandated by law. This is something that clients believe adds value to whatever it is that they do. So as governance becomes much more prominent, front and center, clearly many of our clients, if not all our clients, use ISS in some way. So to say that it doesn't have influence is very, very naive. I believe it doesn't have as much influence or power as people attribute to it. I think that clients, particularly the large, sophisticated clients that have teams inside, use ISS in many, many ways and come up with their own custom policies in terms of how they vote. There is no question that ISS has influence and has sway, and there are clients who actually look to ISS and ISS's recommendations, and that's how they vote. And then there are many, many others, and I say many others, probably 60% or higher, that actually modify ISS's recommendations to suit their own. And I think that if you talk to the large pension plans or institutional investors, they would resent, because I have been on panels with them, they would resent anybody saying that they just follow ISS blindly. They don't. They have a mind of their own, and they actually do their work. And maybe by exception a little bit, because again, there are thousands and thousands of these that they have to vote on a yearly basis. But the fact is that ISS does influence. But again, the power, if it has any, comes from its client base and its subscribers. ISS is a for-profit venture. It is a regulated entity, but it is a for-profit venture, just like any other company.
Why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? I think there may be one or two. Let's get one here. I think if we can get a microphone.
I'm Anat Admati. I teach at the business school, and I'm interested in governance. I have a big question that you probably won't get through, but we had a talk here at the Rock Center recently by Colin Meyer, who questions shareholder focus in governance. And my question to you is, who is the shareholder? In particular, you mentioned your institutional investors have different views, and sometimes they're actually different. Also pointing out that JPMorgan, where you're worrying about the risk management, has more than 90% of its assets that are creditors owed, as opposed to shareholders, and there could be a conflict between different investors. So both in terms of the shareholders, diversified shareholders versus the shareholders whose entire wealth is in a company, and between investor kinds of conflicts, how do you view sort of the corporate governance question? It's a very big picture question, but I've always been fascinated by who's the shareholder.
It's a very big question, so I'll try to quickly. By the way, when I was at the business school, I went to the business school here too, governance was not prominent in the curriculum, unfortunately. So ISS thinks of all constituencies. So all constituencies, and constituencies vary for different institutions. Obviously, financial institutions have a whole different set of parameters, and risk is a much higher profile for institutions such as JPMorgan and other large banks because of what you say. There is a significant component of depositors and others. But at the end of the day, the primary constituency that ISS serves are the shareholders, right? The owners of the company. Those are the ones, those are our clients, and those are the ones that actually, at the end of the process, are the ones that are paying for our service and are the ones that are looking to us in terms of our recommendation for them to make the decision. So I'm trying to summarize it, but well, there's different shareholders, right? I think that's what you were getting at. So sure, there are many different voices, right? You have pension plans who view things much more differently maybe than index funds, that view things much more differently than asset managers, hedge funds, activists, right? Activists are now becoming much more front and center, and we take all of them into account. Many times ISS has been accused of being pro-labor, so to speak, many times, and we've been accused of being pro-activist. And actually, if you look at the recommendation in both of those scenarios, you'll find it to be somewhat different than what, say, the popular knowledge or the popular belief is. But we take all of those constituencies into account, and we try to individualize by companies. So I'll stop there, but we could go for quite a while on that one.
We have a question back here. Go ahead.
In a world of extremely clear rules for independence of directors, extremely clear rules with regard to independence of public accounting advice to companies, and increasing constraints and issues with regard to independence of other advisors like compensation consultants and so on, what's the rationale for ISS to continue to provide advisory services?
Are you talking about the consulting arm?
Yes,
of
the
ISS?
consulting arm to clients to companies that you're in fact evaluating.
The question of independence between the advisory services and the recommendations?
Yes, exactly. And if it's not satisfactory for a public accounting firm because of the potential conflict of interest, to provide consulting services to its auditing account, what's the rationale for ISS in maintaining its independence?
So if you look at investment banks, for example, and actually you look at accounting firms, right, including the ones that we use at MSCI, they provide multitude of services, and not only public accounting, auditing services. They provide all kinds of services under the same roof, and they manage the conflict. We do the same. The reason that there is a consulting arm is because there's demand for the product, pure and simple. We have companies that are interested in knowing more about how to go about designing the plans. Large companies have vast resources in many instances and can do it, but there are thousands and thousands of companies out there who are interested in knowing how they can go about putting together a plan, a comp plan, and our consulting arm helps them do that. There is a tremendous Chinese wall there, firewall separation between the two. But it's fair criticism. We don't think there's a conflict. We believe we manage it extremely aggressive. We haven't had any breach. But it's something that ISS gets accused of. But we're not the only company that manages many different businesses, so to speak, that you could think that they're at odds with each other, but they're not. They don't talk to each other.
We've got time for one more question, if I can see. Yes.
So speaking as a director, I think that ISS has brought an admirable focus on risk management and mitigation to the board. To me, the most well-founded criticism I hear of ISS ratings is that you don't really have evidence of their predictive power. Therefore, our report cards get graded and there are consequences, but we don't think you have evidence of their predictive power when it comes to risk events. What do you think?
I think that we could go on for quite a while on this one, but ISS was never created to essentially say add alpha to a decision. It is a risk mitigation tool. That's how it came about. And shareholders of companies, owners of companies, want to make sure that there are certain governance standards that apply with how you run the businesses and how boards oversee the businesses. And if you're saying that you can pay a CEO $100 million or $10 million, and there might not be any material impact in the performance of the company and the stock price, I would tell you that you would have a significant issue with most of the shareholders with regards to how much you want to pay someone. There are call them social norms that have evolved over time. The roles of boards have evolved over time in terms of what they're expected to do. And risk mitigation is not necessarily linked to a positive return yet. We are seeing, though, and I think the part of the part of that argument that many people miss is and it's hard to, I guess, disprove the negative, but what happens if you don't have these kind of risk controls? So it may be that having a very tough risk committee at a financial institution that is not allowing a bank to be extremely aggressive in their trading, it might be that you are precluding them from significant gain in some way that would have a positive impact on the stock price. What people are saying, what shareholders are saying is, I might be willing to give some of that up to make sure that you don't blow up with what you're doing. And how do you measure that? So preventing someone from taking or making a decision that could be extremely negative and put your company in harm's way is what many directors are expected to do. That's what shareholders are looking to you for. So it's not only that side of the equation. Does governance add positive value, or the ISS's recommendations are accretive to share price? That could be part of it, but it's not necessarily the majority of what this is all about. So having said that, we are looking and we're spending a lot of time to see if there are signals, if you want to call it that, inside of the data. And hopefully we're working with our databases and trying to figure out how we can actually slice and dice the data to see if that's the case. But that's not really ISS's mission, and that's not what clients want us to do, and it's certainly not what clients want boards to do. Again, they want you to be good stewards of the business and obviously try to maximize whether it's share price or call it company performance, but they also want a risk mitigation, risk control, and board oversight of the management team. And that's what they expect. And again, you're essentially trying to manage the downside as well as to provide an upside. So just to say ISS comes up with all these recommendations and it's not clear that they add value, I can tell you in no uncertain terms that the perception is that if they don't add value, they surely help in making sure that there is some sort of a safety net at companies, and it forces directors to think about risk management and risk controls, processes, and making sure that they are the ones that are ultimately setting those parameters and that management is following them. So that's where we are.
Gary, my guess is we could go for a long time, but Directors College needs to move on. I want to thank you very much
Thank you.
being
Thank you for
willing.
having me. I appreciate it.
The next session will start at 8:45 at Paul Brest Hall in the Munger residence. Follow through at the end of this tent, and thank you all for being here.